This morning I'm going to try not to preach too much and just tell a story, and maybe connect two stories together. But that's a challenge for me sometimes because this is one of those dangerous places to be, both a storyteller and a preacher. And my wife's not up here to elbow me, so I'll try to stay on task here with this. I really want you all to have the opportunity to kind of make the connections as much as you can. So this idea of what it means to be saved and how many are going to get through the door kind of thing. The text, we can read it a number of ways, but I think sometimes we tend to read it, if we're of a traditional or even an evangelical background, or as I'm going to be talking on a series coming up about being spiritual refugees, maybe we're one of those folks who've kind of come from some place, and we're here because this place has seemed to open doors, open minds in a way that we're allowed to really reflect on what that means, who we are now in relationship to what we know we weren't or we're no longer. And so this text, we can read it sometimes, I think, with this idea of, what it means to be saved is to assent to these certain creedal notions or these certain beliefs or ideas. And yet, Jesus' whole ministry seems to have been about challenging the prevailing sort of orthodoxy of the time that missed the point, that sort of closed the doors, if you will, a very exclusivist kind of understanding of God's kingdom that he seemed to be against. I think about that song, The Wait, at the beginning, which I'm just really glad you all like that song. In fact, I thought, we got to sing along. It's just everybody was singing along with it. But in my mind, I could see, and I don't know if any of you go there, but I could see Jesus singing this song. I mean, I could just see Jesus and all these all this scruffle of people kind of gathered around, struggling, hard times, and Jesus is there going like, take a load, put your load on me. And it's just like, yeah, that's kind of the earthiness of this reality. That's kind of the wildwood of this kingdom. And it just strikes right to the heart, I think, of the matter. And so their disciples and others are sitting around Jesus going like, so who's going to get in? And it's just like Jesus' message is saying, or his words were saying, you need to pay attention. You just need to pay attention. And it's not easy. It's not easy because the world's cluttered with ego. We struggle as it is. I've shared this story before, but it seems to be appropriate. Some of the work I did at camps would put me in hemophilia camps for kids with hemophilia, camps for kids with cancer, different medical camps for kids. And there was this one camp that I got to be involved in for a number of years. It was an amazing camp called Camp 1 O'Clock. It was out east of Georgia, which is Cherokee country, and it's got deep roots in the Cherokee Nation, the Trail of Tears and all that was there, and then went to Oklahoma, and there's just this deep rootedness of the Cherokee identity. So naturally, when I went to Camp 1 O'Clock, I was like, yeah, what does that Cherokee name mean? And it was a hemophilia camp, and I remember the director going, it's a blood disorder. You're looking to clot your blood because hemophilia, people bleed too easily. We called it 1 O'Clock. And I was like, so it's not a Cherokee name. No, it's a name of who we are and what we need and what we want. And so I was like, okay, so I'm trying to settle into this reality. And it was an amazing camp, the counselors. But then after a few years, we started sharing the campground. It's not a large camp. I mean, the facility's large, but the group of kids themselves, it was not a big group of kids. And so we started sharing it with a cystic fibrosis camp. And it turned out that the directors knew each other. And they'd known each other for a while, which is why they thought that would work. Cystic fibrosis is such a fragile disease and such a tragic disease, and it's kids with cystic fibrosis are very susceptible to infections and to germs and such, and so a lot of care has to be taken when you're working with another camp in presence. We figured this would all work fine, but on this particular camp season, there was something going on that we couldn't put our finger on at first. There was just tension throughout the camps. We'd share the different sides, but we would share the cafeteria together. It was just uncomfortable and tense. We noticed that folks we were having to share the different facilities and activities around the camp, and then we noticed that different groups were sort of competing for that time as opposed to sharing that time. And we weren't really sure what was going on until someone started passing around some rumors, and then you know how it happens in staff, right? You get allegiances in staff, and you get alliances going, and then you get rumors passing around at your workplace. It happens in the church as well. It's just these power struggles that are going on, these egos that are getting caught up, and nobody's really in touch with what's really happening. Until finally someone sort of got to the heart of it and said it's the two directors. But we didn't know what was going on. But they were at each other's throat, but not talking about it. And so part of the thing that I did at these camps was I led group singing, but I also did storytelling, at night. And I had a great reputation for going around to the cabins because I could put campers to sleep pretty easily. Seriously, I'm probably pretty good at that in here, but I was really good about that in storytelling. I could get in there and I said, put him in the bed, get him in the bed, lights are all out, I'm going to give you guys a great story. And then I would just drag the thing out. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, the counselors are going, oh my gosh, this is killing me. But the kids were falling asleep right and left because, you make something visual enough and everybody will go there, but then the story doesn't go anywhere. So there you're just stuck in this scene. And it worked. They loved it. So they said, well, we want you to come around and do that. And then one night, because there was this obvious tension, they said, Tom, what if we get two of these cabins together? And these were two of the most tense cabins. They were junior high, middle schoolers. They were really kind of firing up a lot of this anxiety. We'll put them both on our big pontoon boat. We'll put them out in the lake, and you tell them ghost stories. And I said, yeah, that'd be great. He said, you can distract them and we'll get off this whole thing and they'll be having a good time together. And I said, sure, do that. And let's make it interesting. So we worked with a couple of the staff members from both sides of the camp to get it together, to work it together. And one of them his task was to go out in the water ahead of time. He was actually under the pontoon boat. And when I would get them scared enough during the stories, I would go into the legendary swamp beast story as I'm out in the middle of the swamp. And once you got them kind of worked up, lathered up into sort of this like frenzy of fear, then I would tell them this swamp story. And at just the right moment when I would talk about the guy that got dragged off his boat into the water, the counselor would come out of the water behind me, grab me by the shoulders, and yank me back. And it was awesome. It worked perfectly. I didn't even expect it. It was so fast, and I barely caught my breath screaming as I went under. And the kids all screamed, and one or two of the counselors who weren't in on it, they screamed. Nobody knew for a second what had happened. I think they expected me to come back out of the water and go, yeah. But I was under the pontoon boat, holding my breath and, not saying a word. And it got deathly quiet. And one kid said, what just happened? And one of the counselors said, I think we ought to go out and look for him. And then one of the other kids said, it's too late for Tom, head for shore. And sure enough, they turned the pontoon around, and we were sitting there underneath it, and they dragged it back, and I went under the water, and I swam to another part of the shore. And these kids were just screaming and talking and chattering and like shaking their heads. It's a joke, right? And we let it go for about 20 minutes, and then I showed up at the cabin when they were talking to one of the directors that Tom had been eaten by the swamp beast. And it was a lot of fun. Everybody got the joke, and it was great. I pulled it over on them, and it was the topic for the next day. And the counselor was like, dude, it worked. But it didn't, because it's still not dealing with the issue, right? It still didn't. It just distracted. And we're good at that. We're good at getting distracted from the real issue when it's our ego. We can dance all around it. We have whole cultures that spend our lifetime distracting and misdirecting our ego. And in a sense, misdirecting who we are in our essence in the wildwood. And so sure enough, the conflicts came back up and surfaced. And finally, this woman shows up. And I don't remember her name. She was Cherokee. She was a counselor. She did a lot of sort of multifaceted therapies and such. But one of the things that she did, that was part of her traditional culture, was this thing called the spirit naming of one of the horses. And I've shared in here this activity before. It was profound, but what she did is she brought a horse out into the middle of the stable, and then we were all to get around and watch. And just being around this woman, I mean, she could have been named Gentle Feather for all I know. She was just so peaceful that to be in her presence, you felt like you had some kind of significance you were just now discovering. Just to be in her presence, because she listened so well. And so we all were there, kind of curious what this ceremony was going to be. And if you know about horses, horses are perfect animals for sort of calming, because they will tell you when you're not calm. They can sense when you're anxious or when there's anger. And so a horse is an amazing creature to sort of learn more about yourself in relation to in the wildwood. And so she would, knowing what was going on, she would bring individuals out to this horse, sometimes one at a time, sometimes two at a time. And you could see the horse would jump around, jump back. She made this wonderful statement. Some kid had asked and said, why don't we just give the horse a name, Brownie or something, like that? And she said, because that's your name for the horse. The horse already knows its name. The horse already knows its place. And then she looked at all of us, and boy, did she hit us right in the face with this. She said, all of the animals in the animal kingdom know who they are. It's the humans that have the most difficult time knowing who they are. And so we watched as one by one she would bring people out to the horse. Now, not everybody went, because I think she knew some of the most conflicted scenarios, but I think also she could kind of tell who was kind of uptight or tense or frustrated. And then the best moment that literally brought tears to some of our eyes was when she brought the two counselors out. We still didn't know what the story was. In fact, we didn't know that for a couple of years. But she brought them both out and had them both by the horse, and that horse was jumpy. And she said, you two need to step back, and then the horse would calm down. She brought him back in, and the horse started jumping. That went on for some time, and the whole scene was just still as could be, just watching what was taking place here. She went over and she talked to the two women, and then walked them back over, the two camp directors. And this time, they were both a little more weepy, I think, a little more vulnerable. She had them touch the horse, and the horse nuzzled up to each of them. And then she painted on the horse. And I don't even remember the name of the horse that she gave. But it wasn't, she said, the horse's name anymore. She said it's now the name that belongs to this horse in the presence of you all in this camp. And after that, when she went back to her cabin, kids and counselors were like lining up for the next 3 days. Everybody wanted a spirit name, right? After that, they just like everybody wanted to be in the presence of this woman, which was just tremendous. Richard Rohr, who we've talked about in here before, and he has this wonderful book called Falling Upward. And in the book, he speaks about the two sort of halves of our spiritual lives. That in the first half, or the first phase of our spiritual lives, we're very caught up in our ego. We become very concrete, because that's a part of how we define our reality, because we're trying to get control of it, or we're trying to find our place in it, and we're also lost in our own sense of identity. But he says at some point, when we move into the second half of our spirituality, which is more open, which is more attentive, which is more receptive. There's a quote on the bulletin, and I don't remember it in detail, but he says one of the things essentially that most distresses him about people as he's watched them is to see that there is a curiosity lacking in most people's spirituality. It's one of the things that he finds really challenging and frustrating. There's that place that we have a hard time getting into that section. And we live in a culture, why wouldn't we have a hard time? We live in a culture that is constantly branding us with who we should be. So we're in competition. Even our churches are in competition with each other. Our faith is in competition with each other. Our races. It's part of our ego, and we have so much trouble getting to the essence of who we really are. But it takes all of our attention. As the scripture was saying, you're going to get there and you're going to say, yeah, I know who you are. But no, we really don't, because we don't know ourselves. Nepo at the end, but y'all can come on up, band. Where'd you go? Y'all can come up here. Yeah. Mark Nepo has this book. Incidentally, by the way, this poem by Mark Nepo called Transformation, you need to look it up. It's a beautiful poem that Anne read. He has a wonderful little story. You know, in his poem he talks about sometimes it happens to you. Someone drops the shell that you thought was everything. Sometimes it comes in simply learning to let go of pain and things begin to wash over you. Transformation comes in a lot of ways, but often it comes most fully when we pay attention to what's going on. And Mark Nepo says that in this story, he just says this little parable. He says a cyclist was riding along one day. Now, he was a competitive cyclist, and he'd been training all of his life for his races. And people would say that he was so good at it that this was who he is. This was his life. He was a cyclist that was one with the wind. The wind seemed to part for him. In the movements of his legs, everything seemed to work together, that he rarely lost a race. He was so one with being a cyclist. And on this particular race, he was racing along, had a pace he was a good half a mile or more ahead of all of the other competitors, and coming up a hill, and he'd been in this thing now for 20, 30 miles, and as he came up over this hill, he could feel the wind practically parting for him. He felt like he was in such control and presence in the moment when out of nowhere, this blue heron just leapt up from the tall grass and flew in front of him with such grace and with such lightness that it overwhelmed him. And he stopped on the side of the road watching this bird fly off as it flew with the breeze. And all the other cyclists just passed him by. He didn't ever finish the race. And over the next number of years, when people would come up and ask him, why did you do that? I mean, why did you lose the race? How could you do that? And he would always smile with the same answer and say, I didn't lose it. I let go of it.